I'm Erica Lome, the Peggy N. Gerry Curatorial Associate at the Concord Museum, a position sponsored by the Decorative Arts Trust. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the Concord Museum's new April 19th, 1775 galleries. These are galleries that are years in the making, and I only arrived here 8 months ago, but since then it's been nonstop, and we have put together an incredible exhibition of artifacts and multimedia elements to really tell the story of April 19th from beginning to end. So for those who don't know, April 19th, 1775 was the day when British regulars, on order from General Gage in Boston, set out to Concord to seize and destroy a stockpile of military supplies that the Provincial Congress had been stockpiling in opposition to the British government's presence in the colonies. And so the regulars set out 10 p.m. on April 18th, and hours later they arrived in Concord, first through Lexington and then in Concord. But Concord, the militia and Minutemen in Concord knew they were coming and were ready, and they were prepared. And the events of that day, which culminated in the famous shot heard around the world, really marked the beginning of the American Revolution. So this gallery is really an attempt to tell the story of that day, hour by hour, guided by the objects and the testimonies of the people who were there. And so this is an object-driven exhibition. We have the finest and best collection of Concord artifacts to do with April 19th, and we get a chance to show them off in this gallery. And we also have a chance to really utilize the primary source texts and documents and images that help to illuminate the story. And I'm talking first off about this map behind me. This is a DaCosta map of Boston made in the 18th century, and we've worked with Richard Lewis Media Group to animate this map, and so it tells the story of the day in this really fabulous infographic animation. It also has sound effects, but we've turned them off for this tour. We've also used a set of 4 prints created by Amos Doolittle, who was in Concord right after April 19th and took down testimonies and sketched the landscape and produced these 4 prints that really tell the story of the day. And we've also worked with Richard Lewis Media Group to animate them. So as I go around the gallery, you'll get to see them, and they're really cool. But we'll start here with this sort of iconic artifact. On April 18th at around 10 p.m., Paul Revere had prearranged a signal. Should the regulars go by land, 1 lantern would be lit in the belfry of North Church. And if the regulars were to go over the river by sea, they would shine 2 lanterns, and this is one of those lanterns. Revere arranged for a friend to light the lanterns, and they only shone for about 2 or 3 seconds, but it was bright enough for riders across the river to see and get on their way to start warning all the towns. And Revere, accompanied by William Dawes, the 2 of them set off in different directions to get to Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams that the regulars were coming. And so we're gonna move on to the first sort of beat of the day. So Revere and Dawes get to Lexington at around midnight, and it's time enough to warn Hancock and Adams that the regulars are coming. Meanwhile, the regulars are sort of, they've crossed the river, but they're not really gonna move for another few hours. So this is plenty of time for Lexington's militia to muster and essentially begin to wait for the regulars to arrive. And they wait in John Buckman's Tavern in Lexington. So we have a lot of really great artifacts here that tells this part of the story. And as you know, when the regulars do arrive, they encounter the Lexington militia on the common, and despite orders on both sides not to fire, a shot rings out, and several provincial militiamen are wounded and some are killed. So we have here a dispatch case belonging to Silas Mann, who was there on the common. We have a fife that was probably played in the Concord militia. But what's really cool and most important, I think, to this section of the exhibition is this clock. This is the very clock that ticked away in Buckman's Tavern as the provincial militiamen awaited the regulars' arrival. This clock was made by Nathaniel Mulliken, and it bears his name along with the name of John Buckman, who was a private in Lexington's militia. The clock face and dial are original. The case has been reproduced by Bill Hewitt. But it's kind of an amazing artifact, and I wish we were here on the hour for it to strike, because it was the same noise that they would have heard in 1775. So once the regulars did their thing on the Common, they continued on to Concord. And I should say that this is a company of about 700 regulars who are marching from Boston to Cambridge. So I don't know if you can picture what 700 red-coated men marching into your town would look like. I imagine it would be kind of terrifying. But that's what happened in the town of Concord. By this point, the militia and Minutemen of Concord had been alerted to the regulars' upcoming arrival, and they left town to muster by the North Bridge. So the town of Concord, the center of the town of Concord, was pretty much empty of militiamen when the regulars arrived. And their orders were to seize and destroy military supplies, and that's what they did. And you can see they threw things in the mill pond. They set fire to the townhouse. These cannonballs were actually fished out of the river like 100 years later. These were some of the very items that the regulars tried to destroy. Entrenching tools, spoons, other sorts of materials to feed and equip an army. One of the neat objects that we have is this mirror. This looking glass belonged to David Brown, who lived in Concord. And you probably are aware that looking glasses are maybe the most expensive items in your home in the 18th century. They're very costly. And so the regulars would go into people's houses and bust their mirrors. They would vandalize them, and this was a purposeful action. And you see this happening in several homes. What we have here is one of those mirrors that was vandalized, and there's still a shard of glass. And this just shows you that the regulars were aware of the kind of violence that could be done to objects as one way of intimidating and even waging war. Pretty remarkable that we still have it today. So moving on to the next stage in our day, it's the famous battle at the North Bridge. So when the regulars came to Concord, they split up into different groups. About 100 went to the South Bridge. Another 100 went to James Barrett's farm, where military supplies were thought to have been stockpiled. And another 100 went to the North Bridge. And by that point, we had about 450 provincial militiamen had assembled, not just from Concord, but from nearby towns, Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, Weston. And they were mustering above the North Bridge. And this is where things get really neat, at least to me. Because up until this point, the militia and the British regulars, they had skirmished, but had not outright fought each other. And this was sort of an unthinkable idea. David has likened it to the police firing on the army. It just wasn't done. But what happened here is a turning point. So we have over here Joseph Hosmer, who was an adjutant to the provincials. He was a provincial officer. He arranged the militia and Minutemen into two rows and told them to swap out their flints. And that's a sort of provocative action, because you don't replace your flints unless you're ready to fire your musket. And that's what happened at the North Bridge. And so what you see here are the very flints that were recovered from the field by the North Bridge. And they were arranged just as local historians said they would be, in two rows. This is how archaeologists found them. One row for the militia, one row for the Minutemen. And so this does tell us that this was a very methodical and provocative action, and this was happening in clear view of the regulars who were at the bridge. So this was a declaration of intent. And what did happen? Well, we kind of know the story from there, right? The shot heard round the world. The regulars fire some warning shots, and Major James Buttrick orders the provincials to return fire. And these are some of the artifacts that were here at the North Bridge: powder horns belonging to the participants, muskets belonging to the participants, and a very beautiful example of a powder horn that was owned by Amos Barrett, who I believe was just 19 when this happens. I mean, these were kids. Some of them did die at the North Bridge. Amos Barrett survives this encounter, carves April 19th into his powder horn, and 50 years later writes a memoir about this experience that is just incredibly vivid. He describes the bullets whistling past his ear as they shoot into the water. And we have his account recorded, well, not his actual account, but we have audio recordings of all of these first-person accounts that visitors can listen to at the nearby audio station. So what goes on after the North Bridge? Well, the day does not end there. In fact, it will continue for many, many more hours. The regulars make a strategic return to Boston, but the provincials, now joined by all of these different communities from across Massachusetts, their forces keep growing. So they go from about 450 at the North Bridge to thousands by the end of the day. And they keep up an encircling fire on the regulars as they march back to Boston. So if you can imagine, you can see here in this Doolittle animation, the regulars are marching back, and then from behind stone walls and behind trees and from ridges, the provincials are firing back. And this keeps up for about 6 or 7 hours. This is an arduous trek back to Boston, and some of the harshest fighting of the day happens in present-day Arlington. Some of the bloodiest and most violent encounters. This is a watch belonging to Lieutenant Ezekiel Marsh, who was from Danvers, all clear across Massachusetts. Danvers showed up, and he's at Arlington, or what was called Monotony, and at the Jason Russell house, there are several people killed. It's a very bloody encounter, and he's carrying this pocket watch in his pocket. And the regulars, meanwhile, are exhausted. They've been relieved by a column of a new 1,000 regulars coming from Boston, but that's really not enough because the violence continues, and by the end of the day, they are tired and beaten and bloody, and some of them just abandon their weapons. So here we have this fabulous sword. It's actually quite beautiful. And this is a sword belonging to a British regular officer who, on his way back to Boston, just discarded it, along with his musket. And this was found later on by a Concord resident. And so it tells us that the regulars were willing to give up their material, beautiful material objects for the sake of their own lives. And the day ends with the regulars making it back to Boston, with the provincials hot on their heels, and this begins the siege of Boston, which really sort of gets the American Revolution going. And that's sort of where we end our narrative here, but it's worth it to mention a couple of things that we thought it important to include in this exhibition. As you can see here, we have a list of the dead and wounded from Concord. From April 19th, including Concord, Lexington, and one of the names stands out. It's Prince Estabrook, who is identified here as a Negro man, and he was wounded on Lexington Common. One of the things we really wanted to do with this exhibition is talk about the historical record and who is omitted. More often than not, these artifacts represent the perspectives of white, landowning, wealthy Concord citizens. But we do know, for example, that a couple dozen enslaved and free men of color participated in April 19th. Hey, you can hear it. It's pretty cool. That's the sound they heard at Buckman Tavern. But we wanted to make sure that at every level of interpretation in this gallery, you were learning about people of color, you were learning about women, you were learning about people that have often been left off the historical record. And we've done that by providing a couple of different ways that visitors can engage with this narrative. For instance, we have these look closely prompts that allow you to sort of step into the shoes of a historian and do the work to find these people in muster rolls, in broadsides, in newspapers. And that's something we're really excited to share with visitors. And it's, bringing our interpretation in step with where contemporary scholarship is on early American history. So there are a lot of really great additional elements in this gallery, but I'm gonna let you actually visit and try them out for yourselves. But we're gonna step now into Focus Gallery 1, which tells the story of Concord on the eve of Revolution and features some of the highlights of our decorative arts collection. So. It was important to us that we show visitors what it was that the provincials were willing to give up in their fight for liberty. These are all furnishings owned and even made by the participants of April 19th. These are the people who lived in Concord, who worked in Concord, and on the morning of April 19th, they literally left these things behind in their home as they went to fight on the North Bridge. Some of them were willing to stake their life and their property on the promise of liberty and freedom. But what we're trying to do in this gallery is complicate that story a little bit as well, because as you'll see in the interpretation, while the people of Concord, were fighting what they thought was an encroachment of the British government's, a British government's encroachment on their charter-granted rights, at the same time there were enslaved people in Concord, and the people of Concord were fully willing participants in a British Atlantic world of goods that included trade in enslaved people and also the violent extraction of resources like mahogany, sugar, and tea. And so the interpretation in this gallery addresses that while also letting you see the world, the beautiful British world of goods that that Concordians lived with on the eve of Revolution. And I'm going to hand things over to our curator, David Wood, who can give a little bit more detail as to what you're looking at in this gallery.
Thank you. So I'm David Wood, curator of the Concord Museum. And I want to just look a little more closely at some of the items that we have here. This, for instance, a nice Boston block front chest of 4 drawers that belonged to James Barrett, who was in overall command of the provincial forces on April 19th. And next to it is a high chest made by Joseph Hosmer, the adjutant at the bridge, who you saw just a few moments ago. Joseph Hosmer had the most active cabinet making shop in Concord in the second half of the 18th century, with apprentices and journeymen in the shop. This piece bears the chalk signatures of Joseph Hosmer and 3 of his journeymen and apprentices. Next to it is an interesting piece that is not quite as readily discernible as being entirely in the Boston idiom as Hosmer's chest is. The big difference on this group is that it's made without glue. And there are many things that you have to engineer if you're going to not use glue. For instance, the drop in the center of the skirt on the Boston high chest is nearly imitated by the drop in the skirt on the Barrett's Mill. We call this group the Barrett's Mill group piece. Only in the case of the Barrett's Mill drop, it is mortised and tenoned into the that lower molding there. The foot facings are mortised and tenoned into and pinned in that lower railing, whereas those elements on the Boston piece are glued on, which makes a whole lot more sense and takes a lot less labor. There are many details of the construction in this that make it clear that this is not someone trained as a cabinet maker, trained as a woodworker, not trained as a cabinet maker. So this raises for us the question, who is inside the economy but outside the culture, whose labor seems to have no value. And one possible answer to this really puzzling question, I mean, why you would make something as ambitious as this with so many of the stylistic elements of Boston furniture, but are not trained as a cabinet maker, have to go through this tedium to effect this thing. The suspicion is growing that there may have been enslaved labor involved in the manufacture of this group. There are a dozen pieces that survive, including the magnificent block front high chest at Winterthur that belonged to William Emerson, the minister in Concord. There's a Boston-made side chair that belonged to Eleazar Brooks, who's just above it. Eleazar Brooks was at the North Bridge. The wonderful single-leaf, drop-leaf table from the shop of George Bright in Boston belonged to Francis Faulkner, who was a militia officer in Acton. And this grouping, as Erica pointed out, these are the very things that these participants left behind on that morning. Unsure if they would ever see them again, unsure if they would see their homes again, and some of them did not.
I want to point out too, because we have one artifact here that we used to tell the story of loyalists in Concord. Not that many. In fact, I think the people of Concord overwhelmingly supported the provincial cause, except for the Jones family of Weston. And Mary Jones here worked this needlework while she was a schoolgirl in Boston. It's sort of a aristocratic crest trying to emulate what's going on in Britain here, but no claim to actual aristocracy. So their family did not join with the boycotts of British imported goods. In fact, they were big supporters of British government, and it got them in big trouble. Mary Jones's father lost his property and his estate. Her brother was actually jailed in Concord, and there's this great story where Mary actually visited her brother in jail carrying a basket of cherries, and concealed in that basket was a file which he used to break out of jail. And the reason we know this story is because Mary Jones is the grandmother of Henry David Thoreau, who recorded this incident. So, that's our sort of token loyalist shout out, but I think we're a little biased here in telling the provincial story. And the coda of our April 19th exhibition can be found in Focus Gallery 2.
So in this gallery, we're giving the last word to an artist, to Daniel Chester French, whose Minuteman of 1774 was his first commission. He was 20 when he got that commission, and it's the iconography of French's image that we wanted to concentrate on, because as you can see in the sculpture, there's a plow there, and the Minuteman has clearly just put down the plow and picked up the gun. And this is a direct reference to the story of Cincinnati, because this is the Roman ideal of the farmer, citizen, soldier. Farming was the only honorable trade for the Romans. If you do anything else, it's not as honest as farming. So farming really matters, citizen really matters, soldier really matters. And that image, that classical image of the ideal soldier was not only known by the participants of April 19th, but adopted by them, embraced by them. Probably the best known fan of Cincinnati is George Washington, who recapitulated what Cincinnatus did. So this is in the early Roman Republic. There was a crisis. The Republic would create a tyrant, that is, someone at the head who has complete authority over everything. And you're a tyrant for 60 days. And then you're meant to give it up, because the great fear is putting all the power in one hand. That is what the Republic was intended to prevent. So here's Cincinnatus confronted by the consuls. There are his tribunes there with their fasces. They are going to protect him as tyrant. Cincinnatus did what he had to do in about 16 days and resigned his tyranny and went back to the plow. That's exactly what Washington did at the end of the Revolution. He handed his sword over to Congress and said, I'm done. And certainly for Washington, it worked for Cincinnatus. He is really the great icon of the Roman citizen soldier.
And we're really fortunate to have in our collection tea service that was commissioned by the Society of the Cincinnatus, which was formed after the Revolution by the ranking officers, including George Washington. And this tea service bears the seal of the Society of the Cincinnati, designed by Major Pierre Charles L'Enfant, and this was produced in 1790. It's Chinese export porcelain. This service belonged to Benjamin Lincoln, and right in the middle there is actually the cake plate belonging to General Henry Knox, who after April 19th, liberated the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga and carried it down the street that's behind this wall to Boston for the Battle of Dorchester Heights. One of those really fun, surreal moments where you realize that you're kind of standing in hallowed ground. And we're so lucky to have this beautiful set of porcelain that's such an important artifact of this time period. And Winterthur has some, now we have some too.
I would point out too the snuff box, which was given to Benjamin Lincoln by George Washington, and it's a French snuff box, the kind that's called écorche. It's pressed inner xylem, is it, of a tree, the stuff inside the bark, and it's embossed with an image of Frederick the Great, who was a great hero of Washington's. And so this is a heartfelt gift on the part of the commanding officer to one of his favorite officers.
So 100 years after the events of April 19th, Concord hosts a centennial celebration. Daniel Chester French's Minuteman is unveiled, as you can see here. And it was a grand occasion attended by presidents, famous speakers, and Louisa May Alcott, who was a citizen of Concord, did not enjoy the festivities the same way as the men did. In fact, she wrote that women of Concord were essentially excluded from the festivities, and that their work and them being descendants of these same revolutionary soldiers was of no consequence, seemingly. And she sort of sets it up that, we're not done. That the revolution that was fought on April 19, 1775, and the revolution that was fought in the 18th century was maybe done for some people, but not for everyone. And we kind of leave this here as a final note, because this is really only phase 2 of our 3-phase new museum experience, telling this story. And then in June, we'll be unveiling about 9 new galleries which will tell more stories of Concord, including the story of Alcott, of the Transcendentalists, the anti-slavery movement here, and the experiences of African Americans who lived in Concord. So stay tuned for that, because if you enjoyed this, boy, are you going to enjoy everything else. And I was so happy to have a chance with David today to give you a tour of these new galleries. And thankfully, you know, even with COVID, you have a chance to see these objects, and you can go to our new microsite, shopheardroundtheworld.org, if you want to see some of these objects up close and personal. And we also have full animations of all of the Doolittles and the DaCosta map that you saw in this video. So thank you so much for coming today, and hope you come back soon.